So often we hear people bemoan the use of labels, rejecting them as unfair or even insulting. But is there any other way to understand the world around us? Does anything else work so well in aiding us in telling one thing from a different thing? The fact is, the delegitimization of labels is really just part of the overall movement afoot over the last century that is attempting to reverse the Enlightenment and consign the average person to a state of befuddled confusion, unable to form cogent thoughts and make effective arguments and advocate for our own best interests. Labels are what we use to recognize patterns, and it's patterns that help us understand the world. Without labels, we're no smarter than a turtle crossing a highway, and we're just about as safe. But who am I to talk like I know something? That's certainly a fair question. I'm just an ordinary guy. Years ago, I earned middling grades at a second-tier university and just barely escaped with a degree in history. It really was that close. I am proud of this damn thing. Then, I read some books. Now, I finally had something to work with. It's from this point that I started asking myself serious questions. I don't think I know more than the average guy, but all of us know something worth saying out loud. This is mine. So, I have a degree in history. Still, I'd not consider myself a historian, and no one else should either. The perspective in this video is that of a fairly well-read guy who has only the intention to help others understand what he has come to comprehend over the past 20-some-odd years about the state of our country and the terrible direction it is heading. My apologies for my bluntness, but I'm just going to say it, and it's probably going to piss some people off. You are either being lied to about the manner in which the various political beliefs of the West are related to one another, or the experts themselves are in the dark. This is gravely affecting your liberty, or the lack of it. Here are two figures I've seen around the internet lately. Both do an admirable job attempting to contrast various political systems and positions, but they both suffer from a similar fallacy that is part of the overall reason for me making this video. It's easy to be confounded by the political speak of our day because it makes some erroneous, fundamental assumptions that do nothing but cloud the political waters. I'm going to attempt to filter those waters and make them clear again. But how can this be? How can obviously thoughtful people of apparent good faith get it so wrong? This is part of the reason. They are trying to put two things together that are not the same, but why? The why gets a little sticky and long-winded, but the natures of the two separate things that are trying to be described as if they were the same are simple, and I will try to describe them next. The governmental forms of the West vary greatly, but these differences are often simply glossed over, and the entirety of Western civilization is treated as if one can consider someone in Europe who is on the right the same as someone on the right in the U.S. This is a mistake. But to understand why, we have to understand the different types of political systems at work. The parliamentary system. This system developed over many centuries in Europe, especially England, as powerful aristocrats sought to protect that power from that of the encroaching monarchs who were growing stronger with time. Eventually, commoners gained political power and a share in the decisions in Parliament. But the parliamentary system contained the propensity for the constant concentration of power as monarchs, noblemen, and commoners alike each strove for more power for themselves. In short, it was a system prone to the concentration of political power. Over time, people who had once been subject to a powerful monarch now found themselves all the more so subject to a powerful parliament with little or no recourse if their rights were tread upon. The presidential system. The men who crafted this system knew well the power-concentrating tendencies of the political system they had so recently thrown off, and had no desire to create a new one for themselves in their new country. What they devised was a federal republic wholly different from the political system they had just left. First, they wiped the table clean of the distinctions of class by making illegal any titles of nobility. Of course, people would still be different, but all would be subject to one set of laws. Then they created a federal government in which each of the new states were represented. They divided this government into the three branches we know to divide its power. The powers they gave this central government were strictly limited and well defined. All other powers automatically devolved to the states or the people. This was a system designed to fragment power as much as possible to prevent any one group from gaining power over others with differing interests. A woman is said to have asked Benjamin Franklin what kind of government the people of the United States have been given. "A republic, if you can keep it," was his response. And they did for a while. So what does all this have to do with labels and political spectrums? Quite a lot. It also has much to do with the manner in which the United States is currently being intentionally misgoverned as a nation-state rather than the federal republic that it is. The two political forms are not at all the same, and neither can endure long being governed as if it were the other. I really must emphasize something that is very important and integral to the point of this video and the liberty you enjoy in life. The United States is being intentionally misgoverned by both major parties as a nation-state rather than the republic that it is. This is nothing less than a form of tyranny. We are not free people. Now the question becomes, how did this come about? How did a federal republic, based on the principles of individual rights and natural law, based on the idea that the only just role of government is the protection of those rights, become the hybridized oddity that it has become? Philosophically, the answer is found in human nature. Politically, the seeds were sown with slavery. Slavery was a horrible institution that tended to dehumanize the master as much as the slave. Despite economist Adam Smith's conclusion that slavery would be rejected in favor of free labor, the practice became the norm in the American colonies and subsequently the United States. Now, slavery had always been the norm of humanity, but the contradiction of its existence in the U.S., considering the words of the founding documents, caused friction from the start. Obviously, an entire lifetime could be spent discussing the Civil War and slavery, but these are not the subjects of this video. However, what was learned from the actions of the radical Republican Congress during Reconstruction, that the machinery of a strong central government could be a devastating cudgel against one's political and economic rivals, is quite germane. In the decades following the Civil War, the pace of technological and industrial growth grew alongside the size, scope, and power of the federal government. States were added to the Union as the frontier, and increasing levels of modernity marched westward. And with all of this development came the rise in social ills as ethnically and economically diverse groups clashed over any number of issues that cropped up with the rapid changes in American society. By the final decade of the 19th century, social altruists felt compelled to address the social and political ills that were the result of such rapid societal changes. As is usually the case, however, for every commendable impulse to help the underprivileged, there was an equally cynical one that often accompanied it. The progressive movement had arrived, and its proponents saw no end to the opportunities to perfect the human condition. But to do this would require a level of social engineering that was effectively stymied by the Constitution. Progressives quickly identified what was needed for them to accomplish their social, economic, and political ends. The constitutionally limited federal government must be empowered to act, and the obstacles to it must be removed. The moment came with the election of Woodrow Wilson in 1912. Earlier, Theodore Roosevelt had demonstrated the possibilities of a strong central government, and the progressives of the country wasted no time in codifying the elimination of powers and weaknesses they faced. Progressives had for years gazed with envy upon the still developing parliamentary nation-states of Europe and the power they wielded. To the progressives, it was a tragedy that the constitutional limits they faced in the United States kept them from accomplishing the kinds of social changes they considered advances. If only the fragmented power of the Federal Republic of the United States could be concentrated and then applied by expert technocrats, then all the ills of industrialization and urbanization could be solved. The two greatest obstacles identified by the progressives were the inability of the federal government to fund itself and the power of the individual states as expressed in the Senate. In those days, senators were appointed by the legislatures of the states, ensuring that true federalism could function, with the states having their will represented within the structure of the three branches of the federal government. The founders had been very careful to avoid endowing the federal government with too many avenues of direct sovereignty over the individual American. They created a system that prevented the individual from being yoked with direct taxation by the federal government. These two facts, states appointing senators and no direct taxation, were the greatest obstacles to the progressives, via the organ of the federal government, enacting the reforms in America in a manner similar to the nation-states of Europe. These two obstacles were swept away the very year Woodrow Wilson took office. In 1913, with the ratification of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, direct taxation of citizens by the federal government became a reality. All that was left was for the states to have their wings clipped and be utterly subordinated to the will of the federal Congress. This also came in 1913 with the ratification of the 17th Amendment and the popular election of senators. The idea of a bicameral legislature became moot, as did the sovereignty of the individual states. The process that has just been described was, of course, in actuality a much more detailed and at times agonizing affair. That being said, it is safe to say that it was in the year 1913, under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, that the Federal Republic of the United States of America, with its constitutional limits on government, made the dramatic shift to being a land that would henceforth be intentionally misgoverned as a nation-state, something it most definitely is not. The modern nation-state. In our day, few places in the developed world exist that can be accurately called a nation-state. A good definition of nation-state is a sovereign state whose citizens or subjects are relatively homogeneous in factors such as language or common descent. But this is not the sum total of what the nation-state has come to be. The vast majority of the nation-states in the world today lack the homogeneity necessary to be classified as such, and, due to the friction this creates, they have become ever more authoritarian in character with the passing of time. A closer study is required. The development of the nation-state is impossible to detail here, but a thumbnail sketch can clear things up a bit. In ancient times, the polity of the city-state developed. Over time, consolidation of city-states through conquest or confederation would lead to kingdoms, even empires, the obvious example being that of Rome. Rome and its gradual disintegration in the early centuries of the first millennium are when the seeds of the nation-state were sown. As the power of Rome receded and its territory shrunk, the ruling elite of the peoples of the former Roman provinces developed power structures that filled the vacuum left by the crumbling of Roman power. Over time, these societies became the kingdoms of Europe. Within these kingdoms, resources flowed up the chain of authority as power flowed down. Feudal Europe developed from this system, and kingdoms and principalities took over control of the land and the people of Europe. Entire libraries could and have been filled with the histories of the people of these European kingdoms in the intervening years between the fall of Rome and the discovery of the New World, but we will skip ahead to the reign of Philip II of Spain. Philip inherited the nominal possession of the New World. The challenges of governing such a large area from such a great distance required the development of an efficient governmental bureaucracy capable of controlling it in order to extract the wealth of Philip's holdings. Later, Louis XIV of France further refined the bureaucratic machinery of monarchs before him, establishing the concept of monarchical absolutism in which the king is utterly supreme. It is Louis XIV we always think of when we think of kings and their powers, but absolutism, thankfully, was not universal, the most notable exception probably being Great Britain. Please don't think, though, that this political development was in any way rational or predictable. It occurred in fits and starts, moving forward then backward then sideways. Monarchs gained power, only to be conquered by rivals or felled by disease, their successors losing all the ground their predecessors had gained. The history of the political development of Europe is absolutely agonizing, asymmetrical, confused, and frankly numbing. But the result of all this, after revolutions and dynastic disputes, plagues and famines, and any number of drama or scenario imaginable, was the rise of the nation-state as the basic governmental structure of the European states. Monarchies were either dissolved or reduced to window dressing as parliamentary governing bodies took the reins of political power, propelling Europe to the pinnacle of global power. There was a lot of variation between the various nation-states of Europe in how they exercised their political power, but one defining constant developed that has become common to them all. The final arbiter of any issue is the central government. The power of the governments of the nation-states, whether intended or not, has become as absolute as anything that Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, could have possibly imagined. A common thread runs beneath the surface of the preceding examples of social and political development in the West. In fact, this impulse is universal among human beings worldwide and is inescapable. However, its application can differ drastically and is crucial to the well-being of the individual. This natural force is collectivism. Well, that's quite broad, is it not? But it must be. Human beings are incapable, as a general rule, of maintaining their well-being, and often their very lives in sanity, if separated totally from other human beings. We are not simply gregarious creatures. We are compelled to seek out our own kind and enter into some sort of relationship, implicit or explicit, friend or foe, through which each defines themselves as well as others. We are all members of a collective of some kind. From the moment we are conceived, we enter into a collective, a dyad in this instance, and if God, society, and the state have mercy on us, we are never without a collective for the entirety of our lives. The last sentence indicates that the variety of collectives of which we might become part can have great bearing on our well-being and satisfaction with life. It is in this area where labels, cultural attributes, and politics become quite relevant to the conversation. And it is in this area where individuals can get up to some of the most destructive mischief conceivable if they imagine themselves some sort of oracle or possessor of superior knowledge that enables them to see some kind of better way than that which simply develops organically between individuals and groups of people. Obviously, we have no choice in the first collective to which we are a party, our families, but as we develop, we quickly expand into other collectives with friends, general peers, and, as we grow, various teams, clubs, and organizations, political and otherwise. But for the family, and even it eventually, we are engaging in voluntary collectivism. Voluntary collectivism can be said to be the only form that is moral. I am aware at this point that I am venturing into possibly hostile territory. The affinity one feels for his or her society, nation, or country is often bone deep. I know it is with me. However, it is folly and possibly a disservice to my country if I fail to take a step back and study the polity into which I was born, and my role in it becoming something quite immoral, a coercive collectivism. Now, a certain level of coercion always exists within any collective due to the presence of social pressures towards some perceived norm. However, within many, if not most societies, these pressures involve the franchise, the vote. And in many of these societies, there is precious little involving the individual that is not up to collective scrutiny and coercion. This is becoming the case within the parliamentary nation-states, and it is becoming ever more apparent as social and ethnic pressures build up within them. Democracy practiced without a codified set of limits, that can be enforced by the populace cannot possibly avoid eventually becoming exceedingly coercive to their people. We see this happening now in Europe as the pressures of migration push ever harder against the norms and traditions of the social democracies of that continent, and politicians pander to untraditional constituencies. But how is this possible? Well, we have seen the tendency of parliamentary systems to concentrate power, but there is another important factor that must be taken into consideration. It is not simply the democratic principle of majority rule as practiced in these systems, but it is also related to the authoritative position held by government in these democracies. The nation states have never rejected the idea of authoritarianism. Rather, they have merely changed the political institution that expresses it. Now, I am in no way saying that every individual within the parliamentary democracies of Europe has accepted this authoritarian yoke. Of course, there are those brave souls that, at truly considerable personal risk to their reputations, liberty, and even lives, push back hard against the authoritarianism that presses ever harder against them. But, in the aggregate, this is simply not the case for most of the people there. I am finally coming to the point of why I have made this video. It is important in understanding American politics and the lies that are being told to us to understand the distinctions between the politics of the nation states and the United States, and that our federal republic is the next in a long line of polities stretching from the city-state through kingdoms and empires to the nation-state and now the American polity. This next one is going to be a real bitch to read and probably listen to. I hope that you will, though. I secretly hope that I'm wrong and someone smarter than me will get my mind right. No man is an island, and I'm really hoping someone can change my mind. I really don't like what I'm thinking about my country now. I want to be clear that when I speak of fascism or any other ideologies, I am speaking of an ideal, something that is aimed at but never reached. This fact works to the advantage of those seeking to eliminate the use of labels, so that they may act as they wish without being compared to something unpalatable. I don't know of any ideology in history that has achieved its goal, but if someone can point one out to me, I'm happy to concede the point on that particular ideology. That said, the ideologies on the extremes of these spectrums represent the goals, not the actual ends of those seeking to reach them. When I call something fascistic, I mean that something is pointing toward or close to fascism, but not quite the textbook example. No such thing exists. Even Lenin conceded this fact with his NEP policies that allowed for small-scale market activity. The same goes for any other ideologies, be it communism, capitalism, etc. But it must be understood that the ideologies a group seeks is quite important. It is much better for the individual to seek capitalism rather than communism, in my opinion, though, at least in the current environment, neither could ever be fully realized. This is the general spectrum for the nation-state political paradigm. At the extreme left is the ideal of communism, and on the extreme right is the ideal of fascism. Each extreme is accompanied by its geopolitical paradigm, with a tendency toward internationalism on the far left and nationalism on the far right. It is important to understand when studying spectrums that they represent dynamic systems in which constant change is occurring with the passage of time and the rise and fall of particular policy issues. The most important aspect to understand is that nothing within the nation-state polity occurs beyond this spectrum. The central government is the final arbiter of all issues, and the democratic nature of the system causes it to tend toward being a coercive collective. The glaring problem with such a democratic system, ironically, is that if protected minorities develop within it, as they seem to have done throughout the current migrant crisis, those groups can wield a disproportionate level of power. As a consequence of the inroads of the postmodernist thinkers seeking to reverse the Enlightenment, the cancer of political correctness has metastasized and spread throughout the entirety of Western civilization, not just the nation-states. Within the nation-states, this is bringing about a rather despotic minority rule by proxy through politicians who lack the courage to stand up to them and their aggressive ideology. Here we see that same spectrum populated with the symbology of the extremes. In truth, there are actually very few real communists or true fascists within the West. Those extreme ideologies are just too distasteful for most. What we do see a lot of, however, are internationalists and nationalists. What these types of thinkers don't seem to understand is the ultimately inevitable type of political ideology that goes hand in hand with that sort of thinking. The fact is, internationalism is impossible without the violent suppression of minority groups, which, on the geopolitical level, tend to simply be dissenting nationalists who deny the right of the internationalists to rule over them. It's just how it is. Communist internationalists discover quickly that their economic system does not work, and they are forced to expand, annexing and conquering the nations around them which, in their minds, should be part of their endeavors anyway, leading inexorably to conflict between the nations in question and the expanding international state. The results are a little different when the roles are reversed and the nationalists seek to conquer those around them, as we saw in the 20th century. It seems oxymoronic for a nationalist government to feel compelled to conquer other nations, but these ideologies are easily abused and misunderstood, and generally speaking, have usually been used simply as tools to accrue power by those who seek to rule others. In our current environment, we see a lot of those pushing back against the internationalist movement identifying themselves as nationalists. For many in the West, those living under the kinds of governments like the parliamentary national states, this seems to be their only option. The major problem with this is that there is an inescapable ethnic component to the idea of the nation, and it becomes increasingly difficult for the nationalists to be inclusive of outside ethnicities as the pressure of the internationalists increase. The old world has backed itself into a political corner that is going to be very difficult to get out of. This is the same spectrum illustrating the ideal distribution of the political electorate in a nation-state. The vast majority of people would be inclined to moderate, middle-of-the-road policies that the majority find pleasing. The disaffected on either extreme tend to be much smaller in number and are thus held in check by the majority. While this seems like a completely fair and intelligent manner in which to control the communist and fascist extremes, it can only be seen as coercive to anyone whose policy preferences lie too far from the center, yet still reasonably distant enough from either extreme so as not to be considered a dangerous radical. It is in this manner that democracies tend to be coercive in nature. Not only are virtually all aspects of life up to some form of regulation by the majority given the right circumstances, but also those whose politics simply rest outside of the general will are forced to accept the governance of the majority with no real effective recourse. They simply just have to live with it. This is precisely why the nation-state in the modern world as we know it is a poor form of government. The fact is that all polities today in the West tend to be diverse in various ways, including ethnicity and religion. How can such a polity that no longer meets the definition of a nation continue to be governed as a nation-state? As we watch Europe today, we see that it can't be. That, as the center slowly loses its hold, the nation-state is also faltering as a form of government. The formation of the EU has been, in my opinion, a wrong-headed attempt to compensate for the deficiencies of the nation-state in governing populations that are ethnically, politically, and religiously diverse. How can bringing a continent of foundering polities under the hegemonic rule of yet another supersized state make anything better? The simple truth is that the nation-state is an anachronistic political form that is in the process of an organic transformation into whatever will come next for those in that part of the West. It was to this arrangement of state power the progressives of the United States looked with envy. With boundless cynicism, they used 2 world wars, the misery of a terrible economic depression, and a Cold War against communism as forge and anvil to hammer the American political mind, rendering it accepting of the wielding of such authoritarianism over them as it was used against their European counterparts. This is the result under which we in America now live, an approximation of the authoritarian spectrum of the nation-states superimposed over the two-party system of the United States, wherein the economic and social positions of the parties vary quite minutely, with a few polarizing issues utilized to provide the appearance of major differences between them. These hot-button issues serve to give the members of each party the opportunity to both throw red meat to their respective bases, as well as to judge the current political atmosphere and if it is favorable to making the coercive collectivism now being practiced in the United States even more coercive. Over the last 100 years, only rarely have the actors within the central government made political changes that loosened their hold on the populace. The norm is to continuously tighten that hold on the people in order to secure their positions of privilege and power. The founders of the Federal Republic of the United States had something else in mind, and it is within this something else that we find the existence of what offends the left so badly: American exceptionalism. In his book, The 5,000-Year Leap, W. Cleon Skousen relates to the reader the ideas the founders shared pertaining to the social-political spectrum related to humanity and its governance. Living in the time of powerful monarchies, they were deeply concerned with the power of the rulers who controlled the lives of the individuals under their sovereignty and were keenly aware of the true nature of power. While seemingly simple at first glance, it is only because the ideas contained in this spectrum are the foundation of the presuppositions we as Americans have grown up with. At the time it was applied, the idea at the core of this spectrum was nothing short of revolutionary, and the founders understood that. The feature that is most obvious in this thinking is that the terms left and right, as applied in the nation states, are quite differently when used in this context. Unlike the political thought expressed in the nation state and the false American paradigm, both of which are authoritarian in nature, the founders realized that the true distribution of authority ranged from, on one end, the right, the utter absence of authority over the individual, to the other extreme, the absolute authority over the individual. The distribution of power in the nation state and the false American paradigm are the expression of ruling classes who seek to keep societal authority concentrated and exercised by them over the remaining vast majority of society. Not only is this unnatural, but it is also immoral. It is tyranny. The political parties and most of the television and internet pundits would have you believe that the spectrums you have just seen, excluding Skousen's, are an accurate illustration of Western politics. They are either lying or they don't know what they are talking about. The political spectrum is much more than what you have just seen. In fact, the simple spectrums, devised by those who would make of you a simpleton, are only part of the actual true spectrum of Western political thought. This is the combined political spectrum of the West. Note that the two ruling parties of the United States reside within the same authoritarian paradigm as the nation states. Unfortunately, to one degree or another, all of us in the West live under an authoritarian government. For us in America, it is important to understand what our republic was created to be in order to understand how far we've fallen. The framers of the Constitution understood that the true extremes of human politics are authoritarianism and anarchy. This understanding is the source of the American exceptionalism that so many of our own people hate in America today, because the political system that was the result of this understanding stymies their will to rule over us. Now I would like to take a look at what the founders understood, the political paradigms they rejected, what they created as a solution, and how that solution to tyranny has been to a great extent reversed. That which the framers of the Constitution understood best was the tyranny of authoritarian governments, and they were keenly aware, having dealt for years with both a monarch and a powerful parliament, that there was no form of authoritarian government that was tolerable. It should be noted that while the true believers within the leading American parties probably do not see their views as tyrannical, this does not make them any less so. To people who seek liberty, These authoritarian tendencies are every bit as intolerable to us today as was the dual edge of monarchy and parliament to the Americans of the late 18th century. At the opposite end of the spectrum is an equally intolerable state, anarchy. I know there are many who believe in anarchical systems, but it is impossible to see how they can actually work. At the very least, the most limited and voluntary form of government, the civil society, must exist to make an anarchical state workable. Now, there are many Antifa types who proclaim themselves anarchists, but it is simply asking too much to believe that an upper middle class college student wearing designer skinny jeans and waving a Soviet flag is anything but a totalitarian, and an ignorant and confused one at that. From the time of the Declaration of Independence to the total ratification of the Constitution 15 years later, the United States operated under the Articles of Confederation. The Confederate form of government proved unworkable and came to be considered by most as simply a more organized form of anarchy, if that line of thought isn't too oxymoronic. When a convention was called to correct the deficiencies of the Articles, the framers scrapped it altogether as just another state of anarchy and moved forward crafting the Constitution. It is important to revisit the concept of the collective nature of humanity. We are driven by the deepest of instincts to become part of something, anything that will give us some sense of identity and purpose. This impulse can be either very positive or very negative, and sometimes it is hard to see over the horizon to know that you are part of the right sort of collective. Sometimes the shift from a voluntary to a coercive collective is so subtle that it is too late to do anything about it once you realize it has happened. That is the reality the progressives depend upon to keep their hold on power. On this spectrum, the placement of the spheres of the two types of collectives is rather arbitrary and shifts from one to another, though recognizable in hindsight, might have been understandably imperceptible to those living in those times. Nonetheless, the shift did occur. The framers gave us a government designed to sit firmly within the voluntary collective sphere of the spectrum, and, as an earlier quote indicated, they left it up to us to keep it that way. Unfortunately, we were unable to do that, and over time the Federal Republic they constructed was systematically dismantled. The process began quite early, within the lifetimes of the framers themselves, and the pace has quickened like a growing snowball rolling down a hill. Gradually, as political power concentrated and cultural norms led to more apathy, Americans woke up one morning wearing the yoke of an authoritarian government. The worm has turned, and now the people exist to serve the state. And thus is the status quo. The entirety of the West, including the United States, is being governed in an authoritarian manner by what Angelo de Codevilla quite properly characterizes as a ruling class. Quite frankly, it has been rather simple working out what the political problem is in the West. A solution is much more difficult to identify. Many have taken to the streets, wearing pussy hats or breaking glass at Berkeley, but that is not an answer. Control of D.C. is not supposed to be so important. Once the play begins, it writes itself. Even Robespierre lost his head in the end. That said, how do you get the ruling class to surrender their power? In closing, I would remind people of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. The ideas contained in these documents are the greatest height the West has yet reached, and since that time we have descended back to a height more closely related to tyranny than liberty. I have no answers, and I hope that someone is out there with the wisdom necessary to reverse our course without history having to repeat itself as it has done so many times in the past.